C++ has a number of ways to control the program flow. For example, we have a for loop designed to repeat a process a fixed number of times. Let's examine the syntax for for loops. A for loop will repeat a process an exact number of times. It will consist of a counter variable, which is always an integer, a limit or cutoff condition for the value of that counter variable, and an increment to that counter variable. Okay, let's take a look and see what these mean. This is a for loop. For, and in parentheses, int I equals 0, I is less than 8, I plus plus, and then an open squiggly with repeated program steps, and then a closed squiggly. Let's examine the parts of this for loop more carefully. The counter is highlighted in pink. Int I equals 0. You'll see that we've established I as a counter variable. It's an integer because we want to go through the loop a whole number of times. We cannot go through a loop, for example, half of a time or 3/4 or so on, so it's a whole number idea. So we set up the beginning value of the integer I at 0. The next thing we do is we establish the upper limit for the value of I. You'll notice it says I is less than 8. In other words, this for loop will operate as long as the value for the counter variable I is less than 8. Next, we have the increment. In this case, I++ means that the program will add 1 to the value of I after it goes through the loop each time. So in this case, I started out as 0. I will keep going as long as I is less than 8, but each time the program executes the for loop, the value of I will be increased by a value of 1 as it goes through. So in this case, you'll note that the loop will run exactly 8 times. When I is equal to 0, add 1, it's equal to 1, add 1, it's equal to 2, and so on, all the way up to 8. Be careful because you also must use the squigglies to indicate exactly which lines of code you want to be repeated. Now let's take a review. Let's say that we had a for loop that looked like this. For int I equals 2, I is less than 20, I plus equals 2. This is slightly different from the example you just saw. In this case, we start with a value for I equal to 2. We keep going as long as I is less than 20, and we increment the value of I by 2, not just 1, each time it goes through the for loop. Can you predict how many times that this loop will execute? If you can, write that number down, and then let's take a look. In this case, you'll note that we start with a value of I equals 2. Each time we go through the loop, we add 2 to the value of I. So I starts out as 2, becomes 4, becomes 6, becomes 8, becomes 10, becomes 12, 14, 16, and 18. Now, if we were to add 2 more to the value of I after it's equal to 18, it would be equal to 20. Since 20 is not less than 20, it would not execute that step. It would leave the loop and continue with the rest of the program. In this case, we can see that the loop would execute 9 times, once for every value of I, until the value of I no longer met the cutoff or limit condition of I is less than 20. Finally, note that we have the various portions: the counter variable, the limit or cutoff, and the increment separated by semicolons inside the parentheses. Oftentimes, new programmers will do something silly like put a comma instead of a semicolon or some other punctuation and have an error. So be careful and look for that if that happens to you. Okay, this is a brief overview of for loops. There's a lot of other things we can do. We can count up, we can count down, but I'll leave that to the more advanced programming. For now, suffice to say that you know how to set up a loop that can execute an exact number of times in a program to repeat steps in a program that need to be repeated before you move on. Okay, we'll use this many times.